Hello, everybody, to a new webinar.
Hello.
Here from FilmLight. Again, it's the duo Andy Minuth on the bottom or the right, left, or up. Colorist at FilmLight, and me, Daniele Cirusano, image engineer at FilmLight. And today we have a gorgeous topic, developing images. We've done a couple of webinars, and they were all either technical, mostly when I was doing them, like with color management and other aspects, or focusing on efficiency, with things Peter Postma showed on how effectively manage your timeline. And I'm really happy that today we are finally doing a piece on the creative side, on the art side, and yeah, that's I think very cool. Developing digital images, or how you could also call this maybe how to make digital images look less digital, or you could also say how does all of the stuff we have shipped since V5 all belong together in a whole grand picture. Yeah, and I'm really glad that Andy will do this webinar today, speaking from creatives to creatives. And I'm really happy that he will explain and demonstrate and show all the thinking behind the stuff we've done in the last couple of years and how this all plays well together. Yeah, we haven't done a webinar for a few months, but we want to get back on regular webinars. So stay tuned for more upcoming stuff to go. And I will shut up and go into the background and answer your questions as always in the background while Andy is presenting. And then I will pick a few questions which we can later then discuss in the Q&A session. So that's all for me. I give the floor to Andy.
Thank you, Daniele. So let's get started with today. As you already said, this talk is a little bit about the big master plan that we always had in mind, but to be honest, that we are also sometimes adjusting along the way, how all the tools in Spatial would fit together. But this talk is not really so focused on specific features in Spatial, but this is more general talk about how should we develop a digital image. And there I brought up the term zero fader position. So what is the zero fader position in a digital image pipeline? And the term is coming from the audio world, where we imagine a big mixing console and all the faders are in the zero position. So this is your unbiased starting point for the post-production. What is the right zero fader position in a pipeline with digitally acquired images? And along the way, I will also try to explain and propose a best practice of how one should do look development and maybe also organize the grading stacks. And of course, I don't want to tell anyone how they have to work specifically. This is more intended as a guidance through the more and more technical, let's say I called it here jungle of post-production. So with especially new deliverables coming onto the horizon with HDR and etc., sometimes the workflows get more and more confusing or maybe complex for colorists. So I try to guide you a little bit through that. And if you follow my recommendations, you will have hopefully an easier life. And of course, this is in general, this is just a basis for further discussion. So I would be very happy if you would come back to me with more questions, even after the webinar, when you're watching the recording of that webinar somewhere, leave a comment. I will try to answer your questions, and I'm happy to hear other opinions as well, of course. Okay, so much about the introduction talking. I think let's start. So what is the zero fader position for a digital image? And the short answer is there are many. And now let's get to the little bit longer answer. For most cameras, I would say there are at least 3 recommended zero fader positions from our point of view. And one is how the camera manufacturer would develop that image to a specific display. So in this case, I developed this image from one digital camera to an SDR video display. And so these are different versions of that image, depending on whose ideas were processed during that developing. So on the left, we have the camera manufacturer. In the middle, we have the idea of the academy and the ACES framework, how this image should look on that specific display. And also we at FilmLight, we came up with our own color pipeline called TrueLight Cam, and we in our pipeline, the zero fader position of that image would look like this. And let's go to full screen. So this is the camera manufacturer, and the main difference to the other two is that this one is about a third of a stop brighter in this example. This is the ACES version of the image, and this is the TrueLight Cam version. And what you probably notice is that this is a little bit lower in contrast and especially a little bit lower in saturation. But so far we only talked about the color, but there's also another very important property of images, which are the spatial properties or the so-called texture of an image. And so what is the proposed zero fader position here? So in general, we recommend to always use the camera manufacturer SDK. So these are actually the algorithms developed by the camera manufacturers for the demosaicing or the so-called debayering of the images. Because most camera manufacturers, they have a whole dedicated team of engineers just working and improving these algorithms constantly for their cameras. And so this is what we also use inside Spatial if it's available. And this is also what we would recommend always use. And many people often discuss about the demosaicing or debayering algorithms, but they are not discussing as much the scaling algorithm or the spatial resampling algorithms, how they are called, because most images, when they are shot or recorded in the camera, do not have the exact resolution that we need to deliver the images in. So, for example, if we have an 6K image coming from the camera, and then we need to deliver an HD master, we need to resample the image, and there are different algorithms available. And one first answer is, and there's no definitive standard algorithm for that. Probably the most popular algorithm for spatial resampling is the cubic algorithm, which we see here on the left. So what are we seeing here? So this is a crop from the picture shown on the previous slide. And this image was in 7K resolution. And then I scaled it down to 720p. And that 720p image, I then cropped and scaled up here with the nearest neighbor algorithm so that we can examine the pixels in more detail of the 720p pixel for that slide. So this is just about for the maybe nerds what we're seeing here. And one thing that we can notice here is that in that huge downscale from 7K to 720p, we have some stepping here, for example, on that curve of the open book or on the diagonal line here of the laptop on this image with the cubic algorithm. And here is, for example, here's the Spatial adaptive algorithm in the default setting, which is also the default algorithm inside Spatial. And here we can see it gives a smoother result. But also probably this image will look a bit softer from the perception of the audience. So this is something that might not always be the best way. And so this is so the point here is this is can be a subjective way of seeing things and one that you should take control over. So some people, they might prefer very smooth and a little bit softer images. Some people, they maybe are after very sharp and crisp images. So with higher camera resolutions, the demosaic algorithm becomes less important and the scaling algorithm more important. So this is something that you should also be aware of if we're dealing with 8K Bayer sensor data. The demosaicing algorithm, it does not have as much of an impact anymore on the image or the properties of the demosaic algorithm compared to the scaling algorithm if we're outputting a 2K or an HD master, for example. So now coming back to the zero fader position in general. So we think the zero fader position should provide an honest and unbiased look at the footage. And then you need to build a custom process for your specific project. And one thing that I also didn't show here as a zero fader position is, for example, a washed out log image. So this is something that we also would not propose as a zero fader position. So we are heavy supporters of color managed scene referred workflows, which we are showing today. Or this is actually one of the big parts of the best practice that I'm going to propose. Yeah, so the idea is to build a custom process for your project that fits the creative needs. But not only the starting point of the process is important, the behavior of the process is just as vital. And we are also going to have a look at that in a moment. So let's go back to the color parameter of the image. Here on the left, we see the FilmLight process, which is called a True Light Cam. And this on the left here is the zero position. So no additional operators added to the grade. And here on the right, we see so-called core looks or scene looks added to the True Light Cam process. So on the top, we have one which we call Japanese film look, which is an emulation of a film process. And on the bottom, we have a look called Vivid, which gives very rich colors, but tries to stay away from getting too cheesy and saturated with the bright colors. So this is the idea behind it, that you start with a very unbiased, very neutral, some people might even think a little bit boring version of the image. But this is also sometimes you are maybe looking exactly for that. And then you can add your looks as you like onto the image. So let's go full screen one more time and let's step through some of these looks. So this is the Japanese film in full screen. So I'm just doing it a little bit quickly. This is the Vivid one. And there are also some other ones. This one is also a film emulation, which is called Vision. And it has much brighter reds compared to other looks. For example, this one here is called Complement with stronger cyans and enhancing the complementary contrast. This is a simulation of a two-strip film process called BiPAC. And this is an emulation of the camera manufacturer pipeline. In this case, this is an ARRI shot. This is ALF2 as a look inside the TrueLight cam framework. And this one is called Earthy Film. And I don't want to go into the details of all of these looks. This was just to show you that there are several options available, and all of these things can be mixed and then further tweaked, of course. So this is not something that you would apply and then you're done. So now about adjusting the spatial properties of your process. So this is about the scaling algorithm. Luckily, the BaseLight adaptive algorithm has a continuous slider available where you can adjust the sharpness of the image. And so here I put in the most extreme versions. On the right, very sharp, and on the left, very soft. And let's also see that live on the image. So actually, like in all of our webinars, I'm already in the BaseLight software. Also, my viewing format is already 720p, and the shot is 7.1K. And one concept that you will find at many points in the software is that there's a default for the whole project. For example, for the scaling algorithm, this is set in the scene settings, but then there's a manual override on a per shot basis. So here I can now adjust the scaling algorithm just of this single shot. And so now if I scale into my image here in the viewer, I'm now scaling in with the nearest neighbor method. So I can really examine my 720p pixels here. And so this is the adaptive in the 1.0 setting. Also, I can quickly show going to cubic, and we see it has a little bit more of the stepping. And with the adaptive, we could go also to a sharper version of the image. But this is something that I would not really recommend doing, because if you're using a very sharp scaling algorithm, then you have the risk of running into scaling artifacts. These could be ringing artifacts or also these heavy steps here, these aliasing artifacts. So if you're looking for a very crispy, super sharp look, I would rather suggest adding a texture equalizer tool to your grade and doing the very sharp version more with this than cranking the scaling algorithm up a lot. But going on the other side, so below 1.0 is something that can work very well, because then you stay further away from the scaling artifacts. So for example, my personal preference, and this is just a personal preference because I always like or prefer very artifact free and a little bit smoother images, is for example using 0.8 for the adaptive algorithm, and this is 1.0 this point. And you can see here it's not making a huge difference, but sometimes it can make a small difference. And obviously this is something that heavily depends on the content and on the project. So this is just also a starting point. So that doesn't mean I would do every project with that. And if we wanted really soft, we could go further down here, but this is a creative choice, of course. Okay, turning this off and let's continue. So to give a little bit more guidance, I try to distill few of our thoughts and ideas down into color grading principles. And this is the first one, and this is something that I also already roughly explained. It's called compose a robust process that responds pleasing and is output agnostic. There are some special terms in there, and I want to explain some of them in a little bit more details. And these are robust, pleasing, and output agnostic. Output agnostic means it does not limit your output options and it does not dictate the primary deliverable. So output options limiting, a typical case is you're using a print film emulation lookup table that goes to SDR video or P3, that you end up in the SDR world, and it's then you're having a harder time than delivering an HDR version of your grade. So this is something that would limit you, and this is something that I also would suggest trying to stay away from. And if you have a specific print film emulation lookup table that you think you can't live without, then there's also an option if you watch our TrueLight Can video that is available as a tutorial to convert that into scene look. And the other part here is it does not dictate the primary deliverable. If we're delivering a theatrical film, but that also includes an HDR television master, then we should have the choice to grade the cinema 48 nits version first, and then after that do the HDR television or vice versa. So in the end, I think from a creative point of view, the colorist and the creative team should have a free choice which deliverable they want to grade first and then derive the other ones from there. Then the next thing is robust. That means it does not break when you push to the limits. So when you start grading, it should give you a robust response. So here I have a comparison of two processes. The first one I call process A. That's a standard open color managed pipeline that is freely available. And process B is a process based on TrueLight Cam that I built to mimic the starting point look of process A. And so we can see in the zero position, both processes look almost identical or very close. And then I added a lot of contrast to them, to both, and I added it in the same working color space, which is scene referred. And I used the film grade operator adding or setting the contrast to 1.75 in both cases. And what you can see is that process A here responds, I would say, a little bit more harsh with more harsher clipped highlights and also a little bit more aggressive sharpness here on the details, whereas process B looks in general a little bit more softer. And then now the same example, but instead of pushing the contrast, pushing the saturation very hard. So here I cranked up the saturation also in film grade to 2.0 and in both examples, and we can see that in process A, the colors do not only get very saturated, but also they flat out a little bit here when they're getting super saturated, and also they get very bright. Whereas in process B with higher saturation, the colors have a tendency to get a little bit darker on that image here. So let's see that also live in the timeline, because I have that example here actually as grading stacks. And now let's go into a butterfly view. So here, process A on the left, process B on the right. So here I have the shared layer. And you can see that if I add the contrast, now I'm going way further than I did in the example, how they react. And hopefully you can also see in this webinar environment where the differences are becoming visible. And now the same with the saturation. And also one thing I want to point out is that the global amount of saturation in process B is not really lower, because if we compare the phase, I would say, okay, this one here is a bit more saturated, but this phase here gets almost as much of a saturation push as this one. But then for the really super saturated colors, there's a difference here. And then another thing that I would count into the robustness category is if we, let's put the saturation back first. If we have a look at super saturated colors, in this case here, there comes a flare into the shot, which is having a super saturated violet color. And if we then try to grade it, then we can see if these are out of gamut colors, then we need to deal with them in a special way. And that's all repairable also in process A, but we can see that process B by its core design is already more robust for these situations. So let's set everything back in my cursor and go forward. So the next point is pleasing. It reacts visually natural, sometimes maybe unexpected. It excites inspiration. So let's start with this example here. So this is a shot of a feature that I graded a while ago. And here we see a lot of different shades of green. And what I did on that shot, I just added one of our film emulations, the Vision one. Then it looks like this. And what I thought was very interesting here in this example is how the shades of green are now behaving in comparison to the starting point. So this you could call maybe the zero fader position, and this is then with the vision look applied. Because here in this version, we can see that the dark shades of green, they have a tendency towards blue, a little bit more melon-like greens, and the bright yellows, they have a strong tendency towards yellow. So that's something that was maybe not intended initially, but when I saw that, I thought that that's an interesting effect that I didn't put there intentionally, but I would call it maybe a side effect that is nice, or sometimes people call that lucky accidents. And because maybe for that project, that's exactly the thing that we want, and we don't want all the greens to be in that more uniform hue range. So I just want to put your focus on that sometimes these interesting and maybe not intended side effects can happen that can maybe improve or at least spice up certain grades. And so the idea is that no system in nature is perfect, and you cannot change one attribute in nature without affecting others. So if you talk to someone who's manufacturing lenses, you know that building a lens is a huge trade-off of different aberrations, and aberrations are actually technical flaws or technical imperfections, and then they're trying to compensate one aberration maybe with another, or one one element with another, but they are very aware of that if they change one parameter or one piece in the lens, that it has a lot of effects on all the other pieces. And when we think about digital systems, then when we digitize an image, this is then the first time that we can manipulate one dimension completely independently from the other dimensions. So that's a specific property of digital systems. And so you could then say, so then maybe this is one of the methods that might push our image more into the, I would call it then, artificially digital realm instead of the more natural one. So my point here is I try to encourage you to embrace these side effects. You should really embrace working with more broader brush strokes. So the idea of doing these very precise operations in the image, I think at least for look development, they can be the wrong approach. And usually for look development, especially working first with very broad strokes, you will have an easier life during the rest of the project than later. So and the image here of these kind of flares. So this is something that's a technical imperfection, but we like it a lot. So one of these properties or one of these topics that belong into that topic is domain crosstalk. And what do we mean by domain crosstalk? Here, the first example is exposure to spatial crosstalk. So here I have an example of point spread functions. And so here, this is a synthetic image that I created just to illustrate the point. So let's imagine we have different kind of display technologies and we have a completely dark background and then we put one white pixel into the signal and send it to the display. And so there are some displays, maybe like an OLED display or an LED wall, that will probably show then maybe the pixel as a rectangular shape, very sharp, maybe also as a circle shape, but it will not show much around it. And then there are other displays like a Xenon DLP projector in a cinema, for example, that sends the image through a lens, and the lens will then make the exposure of that pixel crosstalk into the spatial domain. It will spread it onto a wider area. So basically, the surrounding pixels are influenced, and then the pixel might look like one of the other three images here. And in the reality, it's even more interesting or more crazy, one could say, because these here on the bottom are real images that an employee of Carl Zeiss took from camera lenses. So these are point spread functions that were shot with the microscope camera through camera lenses. So this is something that makes it then even more complex. And a very typical example of exposure cross-talking into the spatial domain are also these lens flares. So here, the exposure of one small light source is then creating a lot of effects across the whole image. And this is something that often that we like, but a scientist would say this is a flaw and this does not belong into the image and we need to get rid of it because it's a mistake. And it's not the only type of domain crosstalk. There are just two other examples that I want to give you to think about. One is exposure into the temporal domain. So think about tubes. So for example, a CRT display. So if you have a very bright area, a very bright object on the display, it might have an afterglow onto the next fields on the display. Or think about tube cameras when they have that streaking effect on old recordings of live shows. When they had the lights in the frame, then the lights often had that streaking effect. Or another crosstalk would be maybe from the color to the exposure domain. So if a color becomes very saturated, it, for example, reduces the exposure. So this was one of the properties in the process B example a few minutes ago. So these are interesting ideas of domain crosstalk. And so here's an example On the left, we have the zero fader position in the True Light CAM pipeline. And on the right, I added a complex form of color crosstalk. So exposure and color crosstalking with each other, and also color to colors and color channels to each other. And it can give an interesting result. And then here, to advance it further, I added color to spatial crosstalk. And in this case, color means color and exposure. So the pixel values are crosstalking into the spatial domain of the image. And like in the previous examples, let's watch it full screen. This is the zero fader position. This is the complex color crosstalk. And then this is the complex color to spatial crosstalk added to it. And I hope you agree that maybe even if this is not the kind of look that you're after for your project, it gives interesting aspects in look development, I think. Let's go to another example where I want to showcase that exposure to spatial crosstalk. So here we have a shot from the Venice and with a bright background. And let's first turn the spatial properties of the look off. And what I'm going to do is I will raise the contrast and the intensity of the highlights a lot here by just raising the video grade gain here early in the stack. And the image behaves how we would expect it, I think, roughly. So yeah, the highlights are getting more intense. And as a colorist, we would say this is the expected behavior. But if we ask a DP, and if this would be a scene, would he really expect this behavior? Would he expect his camera and his whole system that he uses to expect like this? Probably not, because if he uses a lens and maybe some filters, he would see these kind of domain crosstalk effects. And that's why I'm now activating the spatial part of the look, and also an elation effect that I demoed in a previous presentation a while ago. And now I will do the same move. I will raise the exposure, or not the exposure here, the intensity of the highlights in video grade. And what you can see is that now the highlights, when they get more intense, they start to glow. Basically, they crosstalk into the spatial domain. Look at the actress's legs here, for example. And so this is something that would maybe not be exactly the response of a real optical system, but has the same general properties of it. And obviously, you could all of these things are adjustable with parameters. So this is something that I think can be maybe a little bit more interesting and inspiring way to work as a colorist, that if you grade something brighter, that it starts to glow. And if you think that's too much, then yeah, as I said, that's all adjustable. I just want to make the point here that this could be something interesting. And from my point of view, I think maybe a little bit more inspiring to work with, because you then maybe see some side effects where you think, oh yeah, that's nice. I like that. It wasn't intended, but happy that it happened. So into the same direction goes this topic here about display MTFs. So MTF is a modulation transfer function. And so this describes basically I would say maybe the spatial properties of a specific system, and in this case, displays. So what I'm comparing here is a high MTF display. So that would be, for example, an OLED display or a dual layer LCD display, which are very popular for HDR grading at the moment, or an LED wall in the cinema. So let's say this is an LED wall in the cinema, and the other one is a low MTF display, which is, for example, Xenon DLP projector, typical DCI compliant projector. So what the curves are showing is actually the contrast based on the spatial frequency. So here on the left, we have very large details and properties of the image, and on the right, we have the very fine details and the very sharp details in the image. And so a low MTF display cannot show the full contrast for these fine details. So this is on the projector, for example, but on an LED wall. And if we think about, again, about it with these point spread functions, I guess it gets clear. The LED wall, it can show that one single white pixel very clearly, and it has a really nice contrast there, whereas a projector will not have a nice contrast for that single pixel because the surrounding pixels, they will be almost equally at the same level. So this is what these plots are showing here. And if we think about the overall perceived sharpness of a system, one method of measuring this is by the area below the whole MTF curve. And so this is called the Heinacher integral. And so if we master an image on a DCI projector, and then we take that image and present it in a cinema on an LED wall, we will see that it looks much sharper and much crisper. And this is because of the different MTF of the display. So we have a really large sharpness difference here. That's then basically the difference is then the difference of the two areas here. And most of the creative people, I would say, would maybe prefer the softer version that they saw on the projector because it has a certain quality that it brings to the image. This is also one of the topics that this talk is here about. But we also need to argue that technically this display is performing worse. And our goal as technicians should be to have really well-performing displays, because certain projects, they might really embrace that high MTF of the displays. They might really like these sharp, fine details and can use it for their storytelling. And also we need to be fair and say that the high MTF display is showing our master more faithfully than the DCI projector. So the DCI projector was not showing to us the true signal that we mastered and rendered into our deliverable. And so what can we do about it? So in Baselight, we have especially, or not only for this use case, but one of the main use cases of that operator is the texture highlights operator, which is actually just simulating a low MTF, or basically it's rendering or baking it into the image. So it's reducing the modulation based on the spatial frequency. So it's not allowing the full contrast for fine details. That doesn't mean it's completely blurring them out, but it's just reducing the contrast there. And it's maintaining the full contrast and dynamic range for the lower frequencies. And we can bake into our master the desired texture of the image. So even then, if we watch it on a high MTF display, it will look much closer to what it was really intended in the grading suite that was maybe using a Xenon DLP projector. So yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I can't really show you these examples here really, because every one of you is sitting in front of a different display. And so you just need to believe me based on these slides. Now advancing to color grading principle 2, solve problems in the right domain. That's also very general advice, and I try to bring a little bit more life into it with some examples that are coming up. So the first example goes into a very similar direction than the last topic that we talked about. It's disturbingly sharp highlights in HDR. So what we're seeing here is the plot of a scene-referred ramp that is running through an image pipeline, in this case also through LightCam, for an HDR display. And all these lines here are in photographic stops, is the spacing of them. So the one here at 14 nits is middle gray. And so we can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a little bit higher than 5 stops above middle gray, we have the signal suddenly clipping harshly. So this would be a camera clipping 5 stops above middle gray, for example. And we can see if we send that image from that camera to an HDR display that has 1000 nits peak white, we will see that very sudden cutoff here in the highlights that I marked with a red circle. And this looks disturbing to us. And technically, we can compare this to a clipped audio signal in the audio domain. So if we have a digitally clipped signal, we can really hear some kind of distortion in the audio if we have some digital clipping going on there with a sharp cutoff. And the same kind of distortion is also happening in a digital image. So here on the bottom, we have plots that Daniela made for a previous presentation about texture. We have a line sweep. And what if we have a harsh cut or sensor saturation in that line sweep? Then if we transfer that signal into the frequency domain with the Fourier transformation, we can see all these added distortion frequencies here to the image, whereas the undistorted image does not show them. And so when you, if you ever grade it on a high MTF HDR display, like an OLED reference display or one of the newer dual layer LCD displays, you will probably have noticed that especially clipped highlights can look very disturbing and really are really not that nice for storytelling when you're working on a real project. Yeah, one of the reasons is, why am I talking about this right now? Because you could also say sensor clipping and clipping in digital cameras happened since the invention of digital cameras. So why are we talking about this now? And one of the reasons is that if I prepare the same image with the same clipped values and I send it onto an SDR display with 100 nits with a different display rendering transform, here we can see that the clipping is nicely hiding in the soft shoulder of the display rendering transform. So there we almost not notice that the sensor was clipping, because these details up there in the brightest speculars are compressed so heavily that they're not really making a big difference. But if we then send the same image onto an HDR display with a different curve for 1000 nits peak wide, then we can see we have that harsh cutoff. And usually colorists who see that, they have the they have the response that they're lowering the luminance. So for example, if you were to go into film grade and then lower the highlights, we would basically then rebuild the soft shoulder roll off. And if you lower it far enough downwards, you will then end up in the end with something like this. Then the highlights will not be disturbing anymore, but then you also end up with an image with maybe 100 nits peaks, which is then not really the idea of an HDR grade. And the thing is that what I want to show you or tell you here is that this is actually a problem in the spatial domain, and we should try solving it in the spatial domain, not in the necessarily in the color domain. So this is a shot here, and I mean, of course, I can't show it really in HDR, but I will just show you, try to show you what I mean by that. So this is a shot here with bright highlights, and now I already added a process onto that shot that also has the spatial properties. And in this case, it's also the texture highlights operator. So the same one that helps with the matching between different displays also helps us in this case. So this is the shot without the process in the 0 position. And this is with the spatial process and a small color process added to it. And so what are we doing here? So let's have a little bit closer look at these highlights. So we're not reducing the light energy from these pixels here. So we're not taking energy out of the system, but we're just diffusing the energy across a broader area in the frame. Basically, we're diffusing the scene energy coming from these lights here. And you can also see it's really glowing here a little bit across the edges of these chairs here. And in the end, it looks like a glowing effect in the highlights. And this is probably what comes closest to it. So what I did here is I added again that same halation preset, and the main thing here is that it works in the highlights is the texture highlight tool. So let's have a quick look at in HDR on the shot. So there we're just looking at the scopes. So the image will now look wrong to you because we're not watching this on an HDR display. So if I turn everything off, we can see that here we have a sharp clipping of the highlights here. And so on an HDR display, this shot would look, the highlights would definitely look quite disturbing. And with, maybe I'm just bypassing now the texture highlight on and off, we can see, yeah, it's definitely reducing also the luminance, but this is the natural process when we diffuse the energy onto a larger area. So the highlights, they lose 1 to 2 stops in energy here, depending on their size. But they're also shaped now much nicer. So you can see now they have a more rounder ceiling or top here compared to the harshly clipped versions in the HDR image. Okay, going back to SDR and coming to example number 2. This is what I call creative color management. And maybe I should give you a quick background about my responsibilities at FilmLight. One part of my responsibilities is to help all of our customers worldwide when they have color management, color pipeline, or issues, or helping setting up color pipelines, or if there's something going wrong on a project, trying to help them out in that regard. And so I can tell you I have a lot of cases that I have to deal with and a lot of experience in that regard from all kinds of projects. And there's just some general advice that I want to give. Please don't use technical transforms for creative purposes. And so this is what I call the creative color management. So this is, for example, you're dealing with shots coming from an ARRI camera in log C wide gamut, but you then decide to treat them as log 3, as gamut 3 cine, for example, because you prefer the look of that mistagging. And so this would be a minor mistagging, and you might get away with it because it's log to log. But still, this is not what I would recommend. Another more severe example would be if you have a log image, but you're treating it on the input as a display referred video image or as a P3 image, for example, and basically telling Baselight, although this is in reality a log image, you're telling, no, this is P3. And this is then when you actually are lying to the color management. So you're not being honest about the real color space of the input image. And the worst case is if you're mistagging your cursor or viewing color space. So if you're setting the cursor color space not according to the display properties that you are using. So then you can end up in a lot of trouble. So generally, just my advice is please don't do it. Please always try to tag your shots accordingly to the information that you have. And generally, I could also say keep the input color space in Baselight on automatic, because then we are doing the right thing. And I never came across a case so far where automatic would limit you in any kind of way. And I have to say to that point that if the footage is transcoded and there's wrong color metadata in the footage, then of course automatic will give you the wrong results. So it should always be about the real content of the images. And so what I am proposing instead of that, so please, if you're having that mistagging effect and you think, yeah, I like certain properties of what I'm seeing now, then try to identify what you're really liking about these properties or about the mistagging, and then try to rebuild it in the grading stack. So typically a color space consists of a transfer function and a color matrix. And so the transfer function you can try to approximate with typical primary operators like film grade, base grade, and curve grade. And the color matrix you could try approximating with the color matrix operator, or what's maybe more intuitive is the color crosstalk operator, and you might get to a very close result. And another advantage from then being more honest to your color grading software is that you then also have distilled that look, what you like about the mistagging, into a layer in your stack. And so then you have full control over it. You can then further tweak it, you can blend it in its strength. And etc. So I hope you get the idea. And if you're trying the mistagging just to see some completely different approaches to process the image, then I would recommend trying the scene looks instead. And also there are not only the built-in looks available, you can also download, for example, the Area Look library from our webpage and try this out on your footage. Another point I want to make here is that we're building more and more complex and powerful tools, and we're putting them into FilmLight. There are also several ones in the pipeline, and these tools are making more and more assumptions about the image. So if you tag a log image that is actually in log and you tell FilmLight, no, this is a video image, then FilmLight actually thinks, that's a very foggy scene and the scene has no saturation, and then this will then really lead in certain operators to worse results. So because more and more operators in FilmLight, and actually most of them since the introduction of FilmLight 5.0, have an optimal color space in which they work. And we call these operators color space aware operators or color managed operators. These are, for example, base grade, boost shadows, texture highlights I talked about. And if these operators are fed with mistagged images, they will perform worse and will probably not give you the desired results. So example number 3 for solving problems in the right domain. So this is a typical task doing a white balance. And so what we're comparing here is using video grade in a display referred domain and then using base grade in the scene referred domain on this shot here. So the shot is lit with some tungsten light, and it's actually also how it is intended. But let's just do this as an exercise. What if we want to give this shot a more neutral color balance? And so what I'm doing here now is in the display referred domain, applying a video grade operator, and I will try to use it with my pen here as good as I can, and neutralizing the shot with the gain. And what we can see is, yeah, we're getting to a more neutral result, maybe somewhere around here. But there are certain issues. So in the shadows, we still have that little bit stronger yellowish area here. And in the highlights, we now have a stronger tendency towards blue. And if you're an experienced telecine or video style colorist, then you would now say, yeah, but then you don't use only gain, also adjust gamma and lift to some extent. And of course, we will get a better result from that. But I guess you see the point that it's not a very trivial task. Whereas if I'm in the scene referred domain and if I use the base grade operator, that's just one parameter called balance, which is doing the white balance, and I'm moving it now towards the colder tones, and we can see it gives instantly a more realistically and also I would say more naturally looking response in the white balance. So if we compare the two, so I could also maybe go this one a little bit more in that direction. But yeah, so I hope you will agree that going from here to here was then the better approach. And so I came up with that slide here to the topic solve problems in the right domain. What I realized is that most colorists go through a curve that looks roughly like this. So in the beginning, you start with trying to learn the tool that you're using. And if you're started recently, this might be a software, or if you started earlier, this might be a hardware color corrector. But let's talk about the software here. And so in the beginning, you're learning the software and you can start using more and more parts of it. And then your grades will become more complex because you're always dealing with complex problems that you need to solve. But then in the long run, as you're growing in your skill set and as a colorist, you come up with simpler approaches. And so in the long run, the complexity of your grades is then going downwards, and it will not go back to complete zero, but it's and also this curve is of course infinitely in its length. It has an infinite length, so you're always continuing to learn and always constantly getting better, even if you're very experienced. And this is, I guess, a natural. This is a natural process that you go through. So there's also not. It also does not make sense if you're a beginner and watching this, trying to take a shortcut here and thinking, yeah, I will never do any kind of complex grades, because in the beginning you should learn all the bells and whistles of your software that you're using, because there are always these shots that really need the full arsenal of tools where you really need to rescue that single shot. But my point here is that when you're growing as a colorist, usually you have the tendency to finding solutions that are working in the right domain, maybe. And I'm just trying to encourage you, always try to keep learning and try different approaches, because if a solution seems too complicated, take a step back and find another approach. Sometimes it can be maybe very simple, and if a simple solution gives you a nice result, then probably you found a good approach here. So this is just another quick example going in that direction. So here I have a series of shots. So these are some kids in a post-apocalyptic desert. And the idea here is that this should be a very dry environment. So that's already set here with the grade and the look. So actually the look is now here already doing the biggest part. So this is a base grade and 2 scene looks in combination. But the idea here is to get out a little bit more of the greens here in these plants. So the look should be really dried out. And so one idea here would be to key the greens and then turn them into something a little bit more brownish and in a dark brown, and which works nice here on that shot. But if we try the same approach with the same key on the series of shots, we see that on some shots the key does not work very good, and also on other shots it might work, but it gives a little bit different results than on the previous one. And of course we can then start tweaking the key on a shot by shot basis, but that's not the real point here, because here I have the same shots and here I already added a color crosstalk operator. And let's go to the same shot here. And so what I'm doing in the color crosstalk is I'm adding crosstalk between the different color channels. So the main thing here is I'm adding negative green to the blue output. That means the more green we have in the image, the more blue we are sucking out, and less blue means turning it more into yellow. And then we're also mixing in more red and blue into the green. That makes the greens also darker, actually. So this is an effect that also gives us a very similar response. And this one here is working nicely across the whole sequence without any further tweaking. So for the look development, this would be the much better approach. And also some of these side effects that I meant when I said we should embrace the side effects and work as broad as possible with the most broadest brush strokes. Color crosstalk is one of these broad tools that are very robust. So I noticed here on this shot, by adding this kind of color crosstalk, we also get a much nicer separation between the bluish trousers of the boy and the environment. And so this is something that I never intended when I added the color crosstalk, but this is just a nice side effect. And I think that's working nicely in selling the look here. So now I'm almost at the end. And so this is now the suggestion for the grading stack inside BaseLight. So if you're a BaseLight user, you know that the processing order is going from the top to the bottom inside BaseLight. And so in the top, we start with the footage, and then we go through the stack to the bottom. Here, I have a few things here put in, like the scaling algorithm, which are not visible in the BaseLight timeline as a layer or as a strip, but they're happening at that point in the processing chain. That's why I put them here in with some dotted borders. And so now let's go through the different stages one by one. So we start with the footage. Then in BaseLight, typically the scaling algorithm is already applied. So what we're doing is typically is we're concatenating all the transforms that are happening from the resolution, from the format of the clip to the working format, to the desired output format, and also including the creative reframings and tweaks. We're concatenating all of these transforms into one single one and applying it at the beginning of the processing chain. And then, so there are several reasons for it. So one is to optimize the performance of the system, because if you're outputting an HD image, there's no need to process all of the operations in 8K, for example. The other thing is image quality, so that when we're applying just one single scaling operation, we're maintaining the best image quality. So then I add, or I recommend using a base grade, but just using balance and flare. So this is then just setting the base exposure, flare, and white balance. So this is just the initial, I would say, base grading of the shot. And then I combine this typically with the next operator into the first layer, the compressed gamut. And this is adding a slight amount of gamut compression. And this is needed to prepare the image for the grading operators that are coming up. And this is just to sanitize it from non-sensible color values, because from real world cameras, you can get color values into your system that are not making any sense, that are physically not achievable. And these color space aware operators especially, but also other operators, are not dealing well with these overly saturated color values. That's why a compressed gamut is recommended to use on every single shot, because on most of the shots that you're dealing with, they will have absolutely no effect and they will just go along, but they will also do no harm. They will only start working when they're needed typically. Then we have all the layers that we need to grade our shot actually. So this is a variable amount. So some shots might need more layers with more shapes, and yeah, maybe you do some relighting or whatever tools are needed for that specific shot to match and to fit into your project. So there's a lot of grading I know will be going on. And then we have a block that defines the color look. This could be one layer. Maybe you can fit all the operators into one layer, and maybe that, or my suggestion is that it includes one of the scene looks, maybe, or maybe several of them at lower opacities. And this can also include a lot of other operators. For example, the color crosstalk, the hue shift, curve grade, base grade, film grade, video grade, all of the typical primary operators can be used here. And then after the color look, we apply the spatial look, which would typically include a texture highlight operator, as I pointed out before, to deal with the maybe clipped highlights in HDR, or to make your image look more similar on different display technologies. So that's also what I would always recommend, even if you're currently grading, or especially when you're currently grading in a cinema and you don't know where the master will be presented, then adding a texture highlight. And in the cinema, it will not have like a dramatic effect, but it will then help you make your master more robust and matching better on different technologies. And of course, putting a texture equalizer to shape the overall MTF of the image and shape the texture of your project. And this could also include several other spatial operators like sharpen, diffuse, soften, for example. And then this is then happening not typically inside the BaseLight timeline, not inside the stack, but what is still happening is the display rendering transform is applied. And after the display rendering transform, we have two operations that we need to perform in the display preferred domain. One is the mastering color space. So this is a hard gamut limiting operation. And the other one is setting the creative white point. And another view on these stages is in the to look at the image state, because we can draw some lines in here. So until the compress gamut operator here, because using base grade only balance and flare will maintain the scene linearity of the image. Also, the compress gamut will not destroy the scene linearity. So until the compress gamut operator, the images are still what we call scene referred. Other people call them scene linear. And so you could render that out and hand it over to visual effects, so you would not lose anything because the scene linearity is still maintained, and the typical advantages that you have in visual effects by working in scene linear spaces for CGI and integration are all maintained. There's nothing lost. Then after the display rendering transform, we're clearly in the display referred world. So then the color values have a direct relationship to light energy coming from a display. And in between these two, we have a state where there's no clear wording yet, and I called it here indirect display referred. So technically we are still very close to scene referred. So it's basically like a graded scene referred image state, but the grading was done while we were looking at a specific display. So there are some decisions already baked now into the image that were made with a specific display in mind. So that's why it's called indirect display referred. But still, this would be what in some OTT workflows would be would be called like a GAM, like a graded archival master, for example. So it's not truly scene referred, but it's still giving you more possibilities to process it further. Okay. So, okay, I'm already running a little bit over time. I'm just noticing. So this is how that stack would look in the timeline. And this is also my last slide here. So if you got the idea that this would mean that this proposal would mean that all the stacks looking the same and we're always using the same basically layer structure, that's not the case. So the idea is to have the same principle, but every shot needs a different treatment. So some shots have many layers, some shots need less layers. And so this is not changing how you would probably typically work in BaseLight. And what I just did here is I then color coded the look layer and the spatial layer. I said these could also be several layers. And then I also gave them a specific layer number so that they're easier to tweak as a group, for example, or give them a special category. Okay, so now we would be at the point for Q&A.
Thanks, Andy.
I hope someone is still with me.
Yes, we are all with you. It was a constant, discussion. I think there was. I've had a few discussions. I only thank you again for this. I think very well presented webinar. There is one question from Tony, which I haven't paid him to ask this, but he wrote, should compress gamut be done before the base grade? Shouldn't the base grade be contained within the compress gamut as well? And I already wrote him that we had like a long discussion about what to come first and what, but I let you do the first plaidoyer and I will do the second one.
Yeah, actually, I have to admit, I had the same idea as Tony had. So my initial approach was that I thought, yeah, let's do the compress gamut as the very first stage. So first we need to sanitize the image and then we can process it further. But then Daniele convinced me that it should be the other way around. And the reasons are, first, base grade is not disturbed by out of gamut colors. So you're not doing any harm to the image by sending out of gamut colors through base grade. And secondly is the example of a shot that is very off from the color balance or from the white balance. If we imagine a shot that has a very wrong color balance initially, let's say it's very blue, and then we would send it through the compressed gamut. The compressed gamut might then push in the blues heavily, and then you would balance it back to neutral, and then you would have lost some of the range in the blues. Whereas if we do the initial white balance and exposure balancing first to bring it roughly where it should sit in the middle, and then we basically compress in the gamut from all the sides, this is then the better approach. And yeah, and also we made some examples, and then Jelle clearly convinced me this is the better approach. But these are exactly the questions that I hope for, that we discuss. Why are you using this ordering of operators, and why? So I hope there will be more even after the webinar finishes.
Yeah, we had also examples where, right, in extreme examples where doing first gamut compression and then white balance would reduce the apparent chroma noise, because the gamut compression would shave off that variation first, and then it would actually was more pleasing to do it vice versa. So that's why I think Andy clearly stated that this is a base for discussion, and sometimes you might want to change the order and see if this helps. But as a general thought, first doing white balance, I think, is a good point. Then we had another question from Luca. Where would you place your grain in the stack, especially importing scanned film grain?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So, I mean, I know that this, I guess, can become religious among certain colorists. So this is also, I need to say, this is all mostly, especially my personal approach that I talked about today, and my personal recommendations. I prefer the grain very late in the stack. I mean, I would still do it scene referred, because actually I would definitely avoid doing any display referred operations, and I would probably do it just before the color look, because I think the grain should be processed by the color look as well. That's an important property that it needs to run through the color of the grain. Or maybe the spatial look would, if that would influence it too much, then I would put it after the spatial look, but then apply a separate color look process just for the grain. But but I would definitely do it at the end, because I think if we're doing some kind of relighting, and if you're doing it at the beginning, then the shapes could become more visible, and I think that's something that we try to make less obvious, and it gives then a nice overall texture over the image.
Yeah, grain is a topic which we're looking at this at the moment. Okay, another question. What happened with scaling when you have to deliver UHD and HD from Vladan? The question. Maybe that's a good point. Re-summarizing the different methods, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. So until now, that means Baselight 5.2, we generally did the approach that I described. So we were first scaling to concatenating all the transforms into one single one, applying it at the beginning, and then processing it through the stack. And we have most of our operators optimized to give similar results when applied in different resolutions. So if you have a shape with a feathering or a blur, for example, it will, and even a texture equalizer, and that one was a hard one, I have to admit, to get that one behave similar in different output resolutions. But these ones are working pretty good, I would say. And I also challenge you to test that. But still, there are certain operations that cannot look identical when processed at different resolutions. One of the good examples is a median filter that works on the pixel level. And so that's why and also we have the external matchbox shaders in Baselight where we don't have control over the spatial processing of the shader. So the shader just, we feed it pixels, and then the shader does with the pixels what it needs to do. So there we cannot scale the shader with the output resolution. And for these use cases, we have a new mode in Baselight 5.3, which is called process in a working format. Maybe I quickly show it. It's in because this is a Baselight 5.3 version I'm running here. it's in here, it's processing format, and the default behavior, this is the 5.2 or till 5.2 behavior, is still process in viewing and render format, but you can also set this to process in working format. And so then the image will get scaled to the resolution of your scene, which is in this case here 1920 1080. You can always see this here on the top right. Then the stack is processed in this format, and then we add another scale for the viewing or render format. And so this will give you better matching results, delivering to HD and 4K if you have these kind of, I would say, critical operators in your stacks. But still, I would recommend using the process in viewing format generally.
Okay, a few more questions are coming in, so maybe I pick a few, and the others we will answer offline via email. One question from our friend in Rio, which is Saulo. He wrote, "What about the noise reducer and sharpness? Still using it in the first thing in the stack, or at the right at the top?" Really good question, Saulo.
Yeah. So my personal approach would be to using denoising still quite early in the stack, because our denoiser is also making some assumptions on the image, and it would performs better on a scene referred image. But then Jelle already showed some examples of optimizing the image for the denoiser in the BaseLight Q&A webinar, which I would recommend. So there are some use cases where it might make sense to grade the image brighter before the denoiser and then maybe making it darker after it, or putting the denoiser after the initial base grade, for example. And sharpening, I would definitely do as part of the spatial look as one of the last processes. So I would definitely not do it as one of the first operations, because sharpening can amplify certain color values. And then if you're raising the saturation or the contrast after it, it might give you worse results than doing it as one of the last steps. But I mean, obviously, there's always that one shot where it's the other way around performing better. But this is just a general approach that I would recommend.
And maybe the last one, and this is interesting one, which we hear a lot, and I think there is some advice you can give. No, I missed it. Wait a second. Okay, it's from Tim. I find that grading in log can lead to clipping in the scopes in deep colors that cannot be simply recovered by desaturating or qualifiers. What is the best way to combat this?
Yeah, so this is the example that we had with that magenta colors on the shot. So maybe I will go back to that shot, the issue that we had here in process A. So here we are having these very saturated colors, and they're outside of the working color space of that shot. So if I try to tackle them here in the first layer, as I showed with the saturation, the problem gets worse, and the same happens if I try, for example, with a hue shift saturation algorithm. So the only thing that helps here, and this is why I put it into the proposal, and which is missing here in this process A, is adding a compress gamut operator before we apply our grading. And so my general advice is using Rec 2020 as a target gamut, because these are only really physically plausible and achievable colors, and then using a chroma threshold around 0.1 as a starting point. And we can see it's not making a huge difference here in the beginning. It's already fixing a little bit of the saturation, but if I'm then desaturating after that operator, we can see now everything is working nicely. And so if you build your base stack, if you build your base stack with the compressed gamut, with this setting always in it, you will never see that problem. You will just continue grading, forgetting that this problem existed, because the compressed gamut will fix all these pixels and shots where you would have to deal with them. Okay, yeah, I guess you had also another point, Daniele.
Yeah, and I think this comes also from if you're used to display referred grading, you have really an eye on the scopes, and sometimes when you do in scene referred grading, saturation changes, then you see that the RGB parade in your display space is sometimes clipping harsh. But this is also when you build a robust pipeline that should behave better with those types of controls. That's why we also put gamut healing, gamut compression in most of our looks, so that when you crank up the saturation, that you're still on the outside, you have something that protects you from doing too many over or undershoots. So I think another principle is that every step in the process needs to be as robust as possible, because you're adding up a lot of processes, and it's not a good idea as a principle. A thing is to say like, oh, I'll break the image here, and then probably later I'm going to fix this, because you're adding up a complex stack of processes, and the more robust each and every process is, the better the overall behavior when you start to working with it becomes. Yeah, I hope this helps.
Yeah, okay, exactly. That's a very good point.
Offline, because we're already way over that 1 hour. Thanks again. Thanks, Andy. It was a great one. Again, as always. Thanks again for all
the people in the background helping us.
Yeah, thanks all of the webinar angels again. That helps us here and there and everywhere. And stay tuned for more upcoming videos. And yep, thanks so much.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.